Okay, we're recording. Hello, I'm Bill Rolston, and beside me is Robbie McVeigh. We've just written a book called Inisher Hacht an Tauri, Ireland, Colonialism and the Unfinished Revolution, and it's published in Belfast by Beyond the Pale Books. What we like to do in this brief broadcast is not so much lead you through the book, because it's there to be read if you want to buy it and read it, but to give you some sense of why we wanted to do the book and what we got out of the book and how it has helped us in terms of political understanding. Robbie and I have worked before over the years on various projects, and I suppose those projects circled around two things in relation to Ireland. One was colonialism, and the other was racism and anti-racism. And I think that also we approached those two themes almost without thinking about it, also with one eye on the international context and international analysis. So I suppose it was a natural enough thing for us then to decide, what was it, 5 years ago or whatever, we first started talking about doing this book. And it was to be a book on colonialism and decolonization in Ireland. And I think that what we felt probably at the time, looking back on it, is that we were plowing some sort of lonely furrow, in that most academics didn't want to touch the concept of colonialism in relation to Ireland with a barge pole, and probably most politicians even less so. And I suppose that one of the main things that has happened in the interim of us writing the book has been the realization that actually we were, I don't want to be so arrogant to say we were ahead of the curve, but we were on a curve that we didn't even see developing at that point. And that curve has definitely expressed itself now, whereby there's hardly a day goes by in relation to Ireland, or indeed Britain, or indeed other places, where colonialism is not discussed in some way or another, whether it's the tearing down of statues, Black Lives Matter, whether it's the Sewell report, the recent Sewell report in Britain, or Michael D. Higgins' statement earlier in the year that we have to look at the colonial relationship between Britain and Ireland and talk about it. So it seems that, I'd not say so much by design, but certainly we managed to find ourselves more mainstream now than what we were, or what we thought we were at the beginning of this process. Let me just say one other thing before I hand it over to Robbie then. I suppose our single most important purpose was to put colonialism back in the picture as a frame to understanding Ireland. As I said, most academics would not have conceded that that was a legitimate frame. Some would say it once was legitimate, but now it's not anymore. Our insistence was that it is currently legitimate. It is a frame to help us understand the history of Ireland, and more to the point, it's a frame to help us understand present day Ireland. So on that point, I'll hand it over to Robbie.
Yeah, I think that's right, Bill. I suppose that the interesting thing that's happened in the interim is that, as you were saying, we've, for years we've been talking about the significance of colonialism in Ireland and elsewhere, but you have to say that the Black Lives Matter moment in 2020 transformed that conversation around the world, and in quite a complex way, because it was centered in the African American experience in the States, obviously, but it then became a global phenomenon where around the world people were beginning to look at the legacy of colonialism and its impact on contemporary racism. So there's no question that changed the mood music, I think, not just in Ireland, obviously, but in the UK and the States and elsewhere across the world. So suddenly people are talking about colonialism again, suddenly people are taking it seriously, and suddenly people are trying to make sense of the way that it continues to impact on everybody's lives. So I suppose for us that then has changed the context in which the book appears. It's a context in which, for the first time in a generation, people outside the Republican community in Ireland are talking about reunification, what that might mean, what the implications of ending partition could be. That's a huge change from 10 years ago, when it looked as if both states on the island were fairly stable and moving towards celebrating their centenaries without much of a problem, either side of the border. So that change creates what we would call a new conjuncture, a new moment in which all these issues are live, in which the examination of colonialism in Ireland, is genuinely important in trying to make sense of what's happening in Ireland now and what's going to happen in the future. And I suppose in the book we would identify three key changes that make sense of that process. The first is in the north, a long, fairly slow demographic transformation, but one with huge implications. The Northern Ireland state was established as on the basis of Protestant majoritarianism. It was to be a Protestant state for a Protestant people. That's what gave the state legitimation. Now that has changed as we've moved towards a situation in which there's now a Catholic and so-called other plurality across the states. The Protestant community is now approaching minority status in the states. That's a huge transformation that underpins some of the wider tensions that you're seeing in the north at the minute. That then is overlaid by the outworking of Brexit, obviously, which reframed the Irish border in a completely different way, turned it into from being a border that was seen as being less and less problematic into what's now a very contested and international border, continuing to give huge problems and for people on both sides of it. So there's that, and then you lay that on top of that the impact of the pandemic, which at times is exposed to kind of nonsensical aspects of the Irish border. People pointed out that Ireland could have been in a New Zealand situation where it protected itself much more effectively in terms of COVID, but at other times has reinforced partitionism on either side of the border. So, and if you look at those three big changes and put them into the mix, you suddenly see that what seemed like a fairly academic discussion around colonialism and reunification 10 years ago is now a live issue, which is going somewhere. And I suppose our book is clearly an attempt to move that in a more democratic direction.
Right. And could I just ask you, Robbie, to point out to one more thing, which is a consequence of this increase in majority, that how the border becomes something different from, maybe not, well, different from what it was 100 years ago, but different from how it is normally seen as a division between, North and South, Catholic, Protestant, Unionist, Nationalist.
Yeah, well, I suppose the point you're making is that traditionally the border was seen as a border between Unionists and Nationalists, Protestants in the North, Catholics in the South. That is clearly no longer the case. That's just not it never was, if truth be told, but it absolutely isn't the case now. So if you're looking to make sense of the border, for most of its length, it's a border between Irish people. It's between majority Catholic populations, between towns that are Irish towns north and south of the border. So in that sense, it's now quite clearly a border between Irish people rather than a border between British people and Irish people. And that completely reframes then the discussion around what you do about getting rid of that border, I think.
Yeah, and it allows us also, in a way, to talk about Northerners. This constant thing about what do you call us, Northern minority, and these awful acronyms where you get, or not acronym, but PUL, and which is used often, but the one that's used less often, CNR, Catholic Nationalist Republican. I so much hate that. But what we're saying is that what we are is we're the Irish people in the North. That's who we are, and it's just as simple as that, in a funny sort of way. So when we then turn to the question of who are these Irish people and where do we fit with the people in the North who see themselves as British, and where do we fit with those who see themselves as neither, or as other, or as some combination? And in explaining that, we came up with a phrase from Latin America, which I don't think it's been used before in the Irish context, and it's open to misinterpretation. So let me first tell you what it is and then explain it. It's mestizaje, which I suppose you can translate awkwardly as mixedness, right? It's the notion that they have in Latin America that the populations are made up of, descendants of the original conquerors, settlers, the Spanish in most cases, or the Portuguese, the indigenous populations, especially in the Andes area, and thirdly, the descendants of black slaves who were brought in their millions, especially through what became Colombia. So it's this notion that because of all the intermixing between them, nobody is pure, but everybody's mixed. And it sounds like a really lovely, warm sort of concept. In the Latin American context, it can be used much more in a much more sinister way, which is basically to say, yeah, we're not white, but thankfully, because we're mixed, we're on the way to being white. In other words, all this mixing is breeding out the Indian, breeding out the African, and we will all end up white ultimately, even if we're not at the top of the league table now. So it's got that very sinister racist notion in the Latin American context, even though it looks like a nice warm concept. We're trying to bring that into the discussion of Ireland, and especially of the North, to say this, that we are all mixed. I mean, I have Protestant forebears. My name gives it away. For a couple of generations, our family has been Catholic, but they're Protestant forebears. And if you look around everywhere, you basically would be hard pressed to find sections of this population that were pure and unmixed. So what we're saying is, look, mixedness, mestizaje, is a fact. But the question is, what do we make of that fact? Now, one thing we could do is deny the fact, the Catholic who denies Protestant forebears, the Protestant who denies Catholic forebears, we could do that. But what we're saying instead is we're proposing that it's a real call to liberation, is to say, look, we have got political choices to make. As mixed people, we've got political choices to make. Do we want to follow our settler roots into all that means in terms of exclusiveness and protection and everything else? Or do we want to follow our more indigenous roots, whatever extent they are in each of us, looking towards self-determination and liberation? Obviously, our argument is the latter of those two, but we're saying that is the choice that faces every one of us in the North, the Irish in the North, the British in the North, that we have to say we are mixed, and following that, where does our political future lie? Now that leads us to another concept that we've talked about that's not spoken all that much in the context of Ireland or the North, and I'll hand over to Robbie in relation to that one. It's the question of white dominion.
Yeah, just to set that up by developing what you were saying about the concept of mixing. I struggled with making sense of how we were using that term in the analysis of Ireland, and I suppose the point at which I suddenly realised, yes, it has real significance, is where you juxtapose it with the racist notion of miscegenation or race mixing. It's essentially saying this mixing is a bad thing, and one of the key logics of racism is it shouldn't exist. You have to do everything you can to stop the mixing happening. That obviously happened in a classic form in apartheid South Africa, but also in the southern states of America and across empires as well, where there was a huge pressure to prevent that kind of mixing happening, and that was institutionalized in lots of explicitly racist ways. So that's what we're dealing with, flipping that on its head and saying, no, actually, first of all, this is a fact. It happens, but also most of the time that's a good thing. That we are all the product of a very complex mixing process that has to be celebrated rather than denied. Now, I suppose one of the implications is then you begin to look at the classic ways in which that mixing has been attempted in which people have tried to deny it in institutional ways. and that's why we developed this concept of white dominion. Now, where does that term come from? It was the term that was used colloquially to describe the bits of the British Empire that were being offered autonomy at the end of the 19th century and at the start of the 20th century. So it's the classic places that were identified as white dominions were Canada, Australia, New Zealand. There's two addenda to that, which I think are really significant in terms of our analysis. The first is that South Africa too was identified as a white dominion, and at that point you begin to realise it's not really about offering a level of democratic autonomy to these former colonies. It's about continuing white dominance in a new form within empire, because quite clearly South Africa had a huge black majority at that time, and yet it was still offered a space as a white dominion, because what that was about was maintaining white people in positions of institutional and political power in this new dominion status. But it also enters our story very directly, because that was the status that was then finally given to the 26 counties, the Free State that emerged from the War of Independence and the Civil War. It was absolutely not going to be a republic. It was going to maintain its position within the empire, and it would be welcomed into this family of white dominions. And I suppose what's particularly significant about that for us is, of course, nobody in Ireland, whether they were Unionist or Republican, had campaigned for that status. Nobody wanted to be a white dominion, and yet that was the space that was provided to us by empire at that time. So in a putting it very simplistically, whiteness was thrust upon Irish people for the first time. For the first time, they were told that their autonomy was given to them because they were going to be named as white for the first time. And from that point onwards, you see the idea of Irishness and whiteness been identified more and more closely. But it was not a decision taken by Irish people. It was not a decision taken by the political movements that had led the campaigns for Irish autonomy and Irish independence, which were much more based in something that we can now look backwards and say fits with our concept of Mestigache. They celebrated the complexity of Irish identity. They celebrated all these different elements that have been brought together to create a sense of Irishness, including, of course, as a core part of it, the settler population within Ireland.
Moving on from that, it strikes me, Robbie, that if you just got this angle in the book, you'd think, well, what exactly is this book? Is it a political tract? Is it a dry political analysis? Is it a history book? Answer all the above and many other things. Maybe not so dry, but anyway, that's what we would say. But in terms of the history bit, it would be simplistic. I often think about this, that it's simplistic to think that history has lessons, or more to the point, that we learn the lessons of history. But that said, I think there are some things that struck each of us going through this long history, this sort of from Henry II and Strongbow, and that entrance into Irish politics, Irish life at the end of the 12th century. 10th century. I always get I always get them mixed up. Anyway, 1170. That there are a number of things that kept repeating themselves, patterns that kept repeating themselves, and make of them as you will in the current day, but they certainly have resonances to the current day. And what I'll do is I'll name two of them that struck me in the course of the research and writing, and then you can come up with your ones, Robbie. The first one that struck me is this notion of loyalty, and certainly the loyalty of settlers, Protestants, Unionists, as they became to the mothership or whatever, to the colonial metropole. And there are so many examples of that loyalty being a one-way street. It goes right back to the very first Norman knights who came here, who were looked on with great suspicion by Henry II. They were adventurers in many ways. He had mixed feelings about allowing them going into Ireland, being given parts of kingdoms, setting up other constituencies there that might be a threat on his western flank. And so there was a point where, for example, Henry II introduced laws that forbade any ships from England to transport any persons or goods to the Normans in Ireland. This is his compatriots in Ireland. And you have examples of Normans saying, look, you know, the Irish hate us, but I think that actually the court and the nobles over there hate us even more. So right from the very start, they're stuck in this strange no man's land where their loyalty is never acknowledged for what it is from the metropole, from the center. Jump away forward, Battle of the Boyne, the Presbyterians of the north in particular, they suffer, they die, they commit themselves at Aughrim, the Boyne, Enniskillen, etc., Derry. And what happens? Penal laws come in after William's victory. And while the penal laws are in the first instance directed towards Catholics, native Catholics, they're also directed towards Presbyterians who, for example, if they get married with a Presbyterian minister, are regarded as fornicators and can be jailed for that. So they have to, at very least, go and get the marriage blessed by an Anglican priest. So, you know, I'll not go through the other examples, but there's two deep historical ones. Go to the aftermath of the First World War and the suffering of the First World War and what reward was given to that loyalty. So it seems to me that if I was a unionist and read that history, I sort of say to myself, geez, you know, why are we always given loyalty and getting so little in return? Not only not getting much, but getting less than much, getting punished in return for what we've done. To me, that was a theme that ran through it. Another theme, now completely, I suppose, unconnected, but a really strong one that was new to me in terms of understanding this way, was that the choice in Ireland over the last 2 centuries has looked very complex. The political choice facing people has looked very complex. But in fact, it's quite simply explained. It's a choice between empire and republic. That's the choice. That's it. That's what it was at the Home Rule crisis. That's what it was at the debates over partition. That's what it was even before with Parnell and before Parnell. In fact, although it wasn't couched in these terms, you could basically argue that was the choice all along. Yeah. Now, I know, you know, back in the day, I mean, the Confederation of Kilkenny in the Middle Ages was the first stirrings of a national consciousness of Indigenous Irish and others, but it wasn't couched in those terms. But you can see that trend going through it. Where do we belong? Do we belong in a self-determining entity, or do we belong as a subsidiary of something else? And the amazing thing to me was that if you read through the 19th century, some of these great nationalist heroes, like Redmond or Butt or various others, you know, foremost people in politics and the Gaelic League and whatever, they're basically choosing one side of that. They're choosing empire, right? Mm-hmm. They're saying, well, look, we fought for this empire. We've got soldiers all over this empire. We've got administrators all over this empire. It's our empire too. So give us our freedom so that we can participate fully in this empire. So they're trying to square a circle there. You know, we want our liberation, our entity, but we want it as part of empire. And that's a circle that can't be squared. So it seems to me, just to finish, for hundreds of years, that has been the choice, and that continues to be the choice. That's the political choice. Where do you stand? Do you stand in terms of a republic, or do you stand in terms of empire? And that's what we're laying out as the choice in the book.
That's right. And I mean, it obviously takes a more mature political form after the French Revolution, where for the first time, really, you're offered this model of a republic, which is also a democracy, and those two things begin to run together. So from that point onwards, I think there's absolutely no question that you have a choice between democratic republic, and something else, and that something else is always empire in different forms. So I suppose in terms of drawing out a couple of things that I learned, or which I certainly reframed in terms of, I think, their significance in understanding contemporary Ireland, there's a couple of points I wanted to make. The first was in terms of An Gorta Mór, sometimes called the famine. It wasn't a famine because there always was enough food to feed people in Ireland at the time when those people died. But I suppose the significance for me now is that when you look back at what happened, it's wrong, first of all, to call it a famine, as I suggest, but it's also wrong to identify it as something Irish at all. It happened within a British and an imperial constitutional context. So it was actually an imperial famine, and from that perspective, it becomes very difficult, I think, to reclaim any notion of the positivity of empire, or indeed union, in the context of Ireland before that time or afterwards, because when we look back on it now, we see that Ireland was included in the Union in 1800 and 1801. Against the will of the vast majority of Irish people. There's no question that that was not a democratic exercise. It was an exercise put through an Irish Parliament that involved a tiny proportion of the Irish population, exclusively Protestant at the time. So the Irish people were brought into a union and an empire at that moment, against their will. And what was the consequence for them? Within a generation, 2 million people were disappeared. The figures are always contested, but at least 1 million people died of starvation. Another million or more emigrated, and many of those died, of course, along the way. So you got this huge catastrophic event happening at the very height, apotheosis of the British Empire, and anyone who wants to measure the success of empire has to start in Ireland with that. The awfulness of that event, and the essential failure of empire to keep its people that had made it subjects alive. So we still obviously commemorate that event, but the political significance of it happening within the context of empire, I think, is still not properly understood, and certainly not interrogated in the way that it needs to be, in the way that we're suggesting in terms of the contemporary relevance of colonialism. The other event, which I think is certainly underplayed in terms of the way that we understand our contemporary moment, is the 1918 election. Now, what's in Ireland, what's significant of that? Well, people remember now, of course, that it's represented as a Sinn Féin landslide, but they remember less that this was the first and last time that the whole of Ireland was given a democratic vote in terms of what it wanted to do with its politics and with its future, because it's only really after the First World War that you get anything approaching democracy in Ireland or the UK in terms of the electorate who votes. So for the first time, Irish men and most Irish women get a vote in terms of what the kind of politics they want to see in the island. They voted almost, in a huge landslide for a Sinn Féin on a Sinn Féin manifesto, which is quite clearly committed to a republic. You then have the establishment of or the Declaration of Independence, and as we know, a war of independence followed by a civil war. But the point is that you have quite a sophisticated republican structure that emerges from that election, which is quite clearly given a democratic mandate. And in that sense, why the symbolism of 1916 remains incredibly important for many people. The kind of nitty-gritty process of thinking about what a democratic Ireland should and could look like, particularly the best elements of the democratic program of the Second Dáil. the First and Second Dáil, it becomes a model for the way that we think about the future of Ireland. We need to pay much more attention to the kind of ideas that fed into that process. So while a lot of people are increasingly getting caught up on the idea of a border poll and its implications, for me, it's much more important to go further back into history and think about what was the template set in 1916, what was that democratic mandate, and how does it sit with contemporary Irish politics. So those are the two things I wanted to draw out in terms of lessons I learned. I suppose the other broader point that we made at the start is that we have to, you can't not in this contemporary world be aware of the need to engage with history, and particularly the history of colonialism and colonization. So in that sense, we're pushing in an open door, but that conversation is happening around the world, and Ireland has to be part of it. So hopefully we've made a contribution to that.
Right. So, Robbie, there are many other things I know from the countless emails and talks we've had, drafts. There are many other things we talk about, but maybe we'll spare whoever has lasted this far into this to not go into them all. Just to say that, I mean, it would be obvious if you're looking at the website to view this, that you'll see that the book is called Inisher Hachtan Tauri, Ireland, Colonialism and the Unfinished Revolution. And in relation to that last piece, the Unfinished Revolution, you'll not find a blueprint here for how to finish the revolution. But I suppose that I'd just like to end by saying that you will get 2 points that we're making very strongly out of it, which is firstly, that revolution is moving towards being finished, right? There's a conjuncture, as Robbie puts it, there's a thrust going on there. But that secondly, and this is equally important, that the role that all of us have to play is in finishing the revolution. We have to choose between republic and empire. And you probably have no doubt on the basis of this conversation we've had, but you definitely will have no doubt if you read the book where Robbie and I stand on that question. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.